Lydia squealed, and keeled half over with her face in her hands, snorting with laughter. Elizabeth would normally have deprecated such unladylike sentiments and behavior. But on this occasion, what the hell, she snickered herself. Bingley, Kitty said now, as if she was trying to remember something. Her nice little Kitty face screwed itself up into a mass of crinkles, for in truth Kitty was perhaps just a little hard of thinking. But yet she generally got there in the end, and so it was this time also. Bingley. She repeated herself, triumphantly. Isn't she related to that simply awful girl who stole the scholarship from you, Lizzy? I'm sure I'm thinking of the right one. Oh, wasn't that dreadful? And Kitty, bless her, looked innocently around, expecting, oh, what? Congratulations, or perhaps simply confirmation? Even Lydia had sufficient tact, here, to avoid her eye, and look away whistling like a barrow-boy urchin. Mary coughed, and looked alarmed, and perhaps on the point of crawling under the tea-room table to avoid being put on the spot about it. To tell the truth, Elizabeth was more than a little tired of being handled with kid gloves. It wasn't even the most interesting subject at hand anymore, at least to her, now that it had been hashed over and rehashed, at least between herself and dear Jane. Of course, bringing up Safie Bingley had been a sure and certain invitation to stirring up the same old pot of toil and trouble. But where Bingleys were concerned, right now, she was more interested in another member of the clan. I don't know, Kitty, I'm sure, she said with great vagueness. But what about your Charles Bingley, Jane? I wonder how he comes to be buddies with Mr. Darcy. I suppose it makes me acquainted with the fellow at one remove. And how funny that he should come to be a patient of yours, darling, when you never actually met his sisters. Not that that counts as a great loss. I'm sure I don't know, Jane said demurely. He never mentioned it to me, although Mr. Darcy dropped in on him several times, and seemed most concerned for his health. But her face was a little pale, and her manner a little off somehow, or at least there was something about her whole mien that drove Elizabeth on. Now, do tell me, Elizabeth added, what did you really think of Safie Bingley, qua hospital visitor or not? Or rather Safie Hurst, I should say. She'd certainly be correcting me in a heartbeat, if I should forget in her hearing. It was an irresistible temptation to try to lure Jane into criticism of any friend or acquaintance, for although they had those in their circle who swore to having heard her pass a less than flattering remark regarding one individual or another, still it was extremely difficult to verify any such allegation with any reliability. But lo, what wonders might be performed this day? Because there was suddenly a good deal of animation in Jane's eyes, and her beauty was only enhanced by the giddy flush that had started up on her cheeks. Well, she said impulsively, if you must know, I thought she was dreadful. She was in and out all this last week, but I don't think she asked Sister Bates or any of the doctors about his condition or the accident or even his prognosis more than once. No, she just sat on his bed and ate his candy, and flipped through stupid magazines and flashed her ring at impressionable probationers and here Jane caught herself up, and finished with a sedate coda of, however, I'm sure she meant well, and at least she visited, there are lots of patients whose family don't even do that. Her eyes were downcast, and how could Elizabeth assess her level of sincerity without being able to gaze into her lovely blue eyes? She could have her own opinions, however, in fact, she could have a damn good idea of the facts of the matter. Well, this was certainly out of character for the lovely Jane, intriguingly so, in fact. Elizabeth's curiosity might have set her off immediately upon an inquisition, but Mary got in ahead of her, inquiring, was she his only visitor, then? How sad. If I was sick or injured, I'm sure all you horrid creatures would come and visit me, and poke me and laugh at me and not fetch the books I'd asked you for. Good heavens, Elizabeth thought, could that possibly be evidence of the staid and orderly Mary developing a sense of humor? Surely not, and yet who was she to argue with the evidence so presented? Too true, darling, she said consolingly. We'd bring you the funnies from the Sunday papers, instead, and a dose of Epsom salts, care of our dear Mamma. Mary smirked at her, and said, a cure-all. At which Elizabeth laughed, and then turned to Jane and interrogated her further, saying, "Indeed, is it true? Does the poor chap have no other support than horrid Milady Safie? That's enough to drive any man to jump out of his hospital room from a fifth-floor window, preferring certain death." Jane's manner was still skittish, her eyes evasive, but she did answer Elizabeth, just the same. "No, Mary is quite right, there's been no one but Mrs. Hurst to visit him all of this past week, barring Mr. Darcy and a couple of other members of St. Pemberley's staff that he was already acquainted with. I believe from a couple of things that Mr. Darcy had to say in conversation with him, that his parents died in a car accident themselves about 18 months back." Kitty exclaimed, wide-eyed with soft-hearted sympathy and sorrow. Or, at least, quick to sympathize with any young and attractive man in difficult circumstances. One might characterize Lydia as boy-crazy, but Elizabeth felt it was more accurate to think of her as simply hungry for life, and with very little patience for all the restrictions and prescriptions foisted upon well-brought-up young women, even now, at the dawn of the 1960s. Kitty, on the other hand, was simply boy-mad, and there was no way around it, nor more delicate way to put it. "And what about Caroline Bingley?" Elizabeth inquired, here. "Was she in the crash too?" "Surely not, for I'm pretty sure that Safie Hurst mentioned to me that she'd be telling her sister she'd bumped into me." "No, no," Jane confirmed, searching about in her handbag for her purse, for they'd all finished their tea and buns, and indeed Kitty and Lydia cleaned the plates of the rest of them like a pair of young gannets. "Mrs. Hurst did mention to Mr. Darcy, I was in the room, for really Mr. Bingley was very unwell and required a deal of checking on, that her sister was laid up with a recurrence of infection from an old skiing injury, and as a result couldn't get to visit her brother. A great shame for her, I'm sure." She met Elizabeth's eye at this point, and if Elizabeth rolled her own slightly, then well, she felt that she was quite entitled to. All that she had to say on the subject, however, was, "So the sisters are great buddies with Fitzwilliam Darcy, as well, then?" And Jane shrugged, and called the waitress over to ask for the bill. "As to that, I really wouldn't know, and couldn't say, darling. Acquainted, at least, and I will say that he did seem very fond of Mr. Bingley. If a little bossy and dictatorial with him, with it, but then he does have that reputation." "Bossy and dictatorial, heavens! You don't say," Elizabeth murmured. Perhaps she would have more to say on the subject to Jane at a later date, but for now, their tea was over, and it was time to whiz around Lambton with the girls, let them pick out a few items of frippery from the small number of fashion boutiques in the little town, and then go to meet dear Aunt Gardner at the train station where she was picking them up. And Elizabeth scrutinized Jane a little, as they herded the younger girls out of the tea rooms and onto their plans for the afternoon. Yes, there was distinctly something a little off about her today, though Elizabeth was damned if she could put her finger on it. Still, they had, rather marvelously, a simultaneous free evening this same night, and plans, too, to attend a party in the medical school together. There'd be time this evening, then, to have a lovely evening together, and with their various buddies and acquaintances. And also, if she deemed it necessary, and Elizabeth rather thought she might deem it necessary, time for an inquisition, and to find out what, if anything, was really going on with darling Jane.